The story of Kennewick Man begins in Kennewick, Washington, in July of 1996, when two college students came across a human skull on the shoreline of the Columbia River. When the county coroner believed the skull could have been related to a murder, archaeologist Jim Chatters was called to investigate the set of bones of an ancient adult male who was given the name Kennewick Man. Chatters believed that these remains were from a white settler of the late 19th or early 20th century. Upon discovering a stone point embedded in the hip of the skeleton, Chatters sent a small sample of bone to be radiocarbon dated. The skull was found to be over 9,000 years old, making it one of the oldest intact skeletons ever found in North America. Armin Minthorn of the Umatilla tribe came to the defense of the Kennewick Man. The Umatillas, along with four other tribes, claimed that any man found along the Columbia River 9,000 years ago had to have been their ancestor, and demanded the right to bury the skeleton remains as part of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Jim Chatters, after his research, speculated that these remains were not Native American ancestors, however. And so the argument began: who should be given the possession of the Kennewick Man? In my opinion, the Native Americans deserve the right to bury Kennewick Man. To begin, the basis of which Jim Chatters and other archaeologists believe Kennewick Man was not Native American was based on his skull structure. This invalid criteria for bundling groups of people together based on skull morphology is the same idea that Samuel Morton had in the mid-1800s when he classified people's race and intelligence levels based on their skull size and cranial capacity. Morton concluded that American Indian skulls had small cranial capacity and reflected their inferiority to other races as well as their inability to be civilized. This primitive idea of classifying skulls into racial divisions based on their morphology would end up being debunked in the late 1800s. During the late 1890s, a veteran skull collector, Franz Boas, argued against this theory. After several experiments performed on skulls of immigrants to the United States, he concluded that skull shape and size varied between generations, even within the same cultural group. In 1911, Boas again confirms his research by writing, "Head form, which has always been considered one of the most stable and permanent characteristics of human races, undergoes far-reaching changes coincident with the transfer of the people from European to American soil. All the evidence now is in favor of a great plasticity of human types, and the permanence of types in new surroundings appears rather as the exception than the rule." Boas is essentially saying that skull shape and size vary over time, regardless of what their race is. Boas even stated that broad-headed populations can become long-headed within a single generation, and that head shape changes are the result of environment, not race. With that being said, classifying Kennewick Man as a Caucasoid, as done by Jim Chatters when he compared the Kennewick Man skull to other skulls from his collection, is not completely accurate because skull shape and size change between generations regardless of what race the skull came from. Another reason why I believe the Native Americans should be given the remains of Kennewick Man is because of the history of American treatment of sacred Indian burial sites. As Armin Minthorn said, ancient Indian burial sites are sacred, and archaeologists have desecrated and disrespected these graves for the last 2 centuries. Early history museums participated in the Great American Skull Wars, where they dug up bones of Native Americans right from their grave sites, sometimes only hours after their burial. One particular example of this occurred in January of 1869, when a post surgeon in the Dakotas dug up the head from an old man on the night of his burial. Part of Skull Wars reads, "As Indian tribes were being confined to reservations or hunted down, the bones of their dead were systematically gathered and shipped to the newly founded American Medical Museum." To many Native Americans, wrote Douglas Preston in a 1989 Harper's Magazine article, the collection of their ancestors' bones and bodies by museums is a source of pain and humiliation, the last stage of a conquest that already had robbed them of their lands and destroyed them of their way of life. Indian people still associate archaeology with grave robbing. The dispute over Kennewick Man is no different. The scientists are essentially taking the dead and using it for their own agenda, ignoring Indian culture and religion. The Umatilla tribe never ceded the rights and properties of their dead and their possessions to the United States government. They were granted legal right to continue religious practices on federal lands within their traditional homeland. This is an important factor in the Kennewick debate. Since Kennewick Man was found on the lands granted to the Umatilla tribe, under treaty negotiations, the government should not be allowed to take their possessions, which include Kennewick Man. As we read in Skull Wars, the argument is not just about Kennewick Man, but for future situations like this. Then there are larger implications. If property rights can be taken from Indian tribes, from whom else might they be taken? Does the Fifth Amendment apply only to non-Indians? As Armin Minthorn said in a congressional hearing, the scientists and what they propose is unfair, does not consider my lifestyle, does not consider an Indian lifestyle, does not consider my religion.